Good evening, everybody. Good evening. So glad to see so many faces and
Good evening.
let people join as they decide to come on sooner or later here tonight. But I'm Andre Kidd. I'm the chairperson for the history team at First Church of Christ in Hartford, affectionately known as Center Church. And tonight's talk by Dr. Andrew Gardner, he's going to deliver an ecclesial crisis, Joel Hawes and Abolition at the First Church of Christ. Hawes was Center Church's 10th pastor and served this congregation from 1818 until 1864. And we're going to hear a whole lot about him tonight. I'm not going to give the whole introduction because we have somebody coming on to do that in a few minutes. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the history team. The history team is at Center Church, and it came into existence in the fall of 2023 in conjunction with the coordinating executive team, as well as our 1636 Heritage Partnership. We've been putting this together and have been doing all kinds of programs, but some of the focus points of the history team delves into the brown and black ancestry, just some, but also celebrated members and visitors to the church, in particular, how Center Church participated in life-changing American history. We've been digging into that for the past few years. Things like Prince Abdul Rahman's visit to our church in 1828, Frederick Douglass visiting our church and not being able to speak inside, but through Reverend Hawes's push and his strength, the abolitionist that he ended up speaking on our portico steps anyway, with one of the two visits that he made here in Hartford. But the history team has been involved in a lot of projects. Examples of them are on Monday, 13th in 2024, the history team hosted an in-person event at our church for the official Royal House of Surrey, which included Princess Karen Chapman, Dr. Artemis Gay. And they tell their story about their relative, Prince Abdul Rahman's visit here in town and how that was facilitated by Gallaudet, who was a church member and reverend at our church. So we've had many different events, and we're also involved in digging up history and doing projects with the Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at Trinity College. This year, we're also going to be working with Slater Museum at Norwich Free Academy. We just have a bunch of history that we're delving into, projects that we're working on because it's a rich history. We're a member of the Connecticut Freedom Trail and have been since 2022. We are affiliates of America 250 Connecticut. And through that, we're going to be celebrating 250 years of Connecticut history through the city of Hartford. But we got so much to talk about tonight. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, telling you all the things that we're doing. Let's talk about what's happening tonight. First of all, Reverend Dr. Eric J. Hurst joined us a few years back and has been very instrumental in making sure that the history team has a strong and steady foundation. He is a core member of the history team. He's been influential in research and planning, collaborating and coordinating with the history team. He is our Director of Justice and Faith Formation, and he's going to come to you now with a few words to talk to you about what we're going to be involved in tonight. Eric?
Good evening and welcome to the First Church of Christ in Hartford, Center Church. My name is the Reverend Dr. Eric J. Hurst, and I serve as the Minister for Faith Formation and Social Justice here at Center Church. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Gardner, Lecturer of Integrated Studies at Mercer University. Dr. Gardner is an accomplished educator, writer, and researcher whose work lies at the intersection of religion and higher education. He has previously served as a Louisville Institute postdoctoral research fellow at the Hartford Institute for Religion Research at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, where he helped launch the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregation study. His forthcoming book, Minister Factory: The Politics of Theological Higher Education in Early America, will be published by University of North Carolina Press next year, following his most recent work, Binkley, A Congregational History, issued by the University of Tennessee Press. Dr. Gardner's research has appeared in journals such as Religion and American Culture, the Journal of Church and State, and Perspectives in Religious Studies. This evening, he turns our attention to a defining moment in the life of this very congregation. Historians often describe the Civil War and the struggle over slavery as a theological crisis that divided denominations across the nation, but it also produced a profound ecclesial crisis within local churches. Here at Center Church, the Reverend Joel Hawes, who served as pastor for more than 40 years, changed his perspective and became an abolitionist. Yet not all in the congregation agreed. Rather than divide, the church chose to remain in fellowship through deep disagreement. Dr. Gardner's lecture invites us to explore how Hawes and Center Church navigated these differences with conviction, patience, and faith, a story that still speaks powerfully to the challenges of unity and conscience in our own time. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Andrew Gardner, a unique blend of scholar, lecturer, and educator whom Center Church warmly embraces as a friend. Dr. Gardner.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you all for having me again. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Eric Hurst, for the invitation and for all the invitations I've had to speak with you all over the last few years. You all don't know what a gift you have in Reverend Dr. Hurst at Center Church. So this evening, you've heard a little bit of what I plan to talk about. I questioned whether or not I would start with a bit of a preface. And last night I was watching an episode of Elsbeth, the show on CBS, and it confirmed that I should begin with this preface. The musical Merrily We Roll Along had a recent revival that I think really speaks to how we can think about history and the challenges of thinking about history. For those of you who don't know, Merrily We Roll Along is a Stephen Sondheim show about three friends, Franklin Shepard, Charlie Kringus, and Mary Flynn, and their friendship. And it begins in college on the rooftop of their dorm, and they set out and they make a ton of plans as to what they're going to be, how they're going to change the world with their art, with their music, with their words. Charlie and Franklin are going to be musical theater individuals that are going to write the next great American musical. Mary has a book that she's going to write. And the story goes that they meet in college, and you see them. The story is how they progress through their careers, how they end up having to enter through some doors, have some doors closed in their face, in just the story of making art. And ultimately, Franklin and Charlie write a great musical. It's a hit. They end up then having to question whether or not they're going to go for fame and stardom, or if they're going to be true to their art and write continued musicals. And so Franklin wants to go and become a Hollywood musician, write for movies, make a lot of money. Charlie wants to write for the theater. And this creates a lot of tension in their friendship. And Mary has to navigate it as she's kind of stuck in the middle between them. And ultimately, they have a big falling out in an interview on national television, Charlie and Franklin. And they end up becoming estranged friends. And the story ends with them no longer speaking to one another. That sounds like a really terrible story for a musical. But the way it is told is that it is told in reverse. So you are introduced to these three friends at a moment when they are estranged from one another. Mary's in the middle. Franklin and Charlie aren't speaking to one another. And then you go back as the musical progresses back in time, and you slowly see their friendship kind of come back together. And the story ends with this soaring ballad. It's our time, breathe it in, worlds to change, worlds to win. It's our time coming through, you and me, pal, you and me. and that they're on the rooftop of their college dorm singing this song. And as I saw it a few years ago, I sat back at the end of the show and I didn't know how to feel. That you have this song of optimism and hope that's ending this story that really ends with estrangement. It was a very strange feeling. And I think that in a lot of ways is how history makes us feel sometimes, particularly when we're looking at history of institutions and places that are dear to us. That there are parts of history that we really want to celebrate, but there are also parts of history that we are not really proud of and perhaps ashamed of. And how do we balance those two things is really difficult. And so I offer that preface to you all today that we're going to be talking about your church, and there are going to be elements of your church's history that you may want to really celebrate, and that's great. There are also elements of your church's history that you may not be very proud of, and that's also an emotion that is fine to have. And figuring out how you navigate the complexity of that is part of what makes history such a unique and interesting discipline. So bearing that in mind, with that preface, I'll start us off tonight, Ecclesial Crisis, Joel Hawes, and the Abolition at the First Church of Christ in Hartford. A little background to how we're going to position ourselves. So I'm really interested in sharing with you all where I think the history of Centered Church contributes to the broader history of abolition within the United States, the history that is enmeshed in the sectional crisis and ultimately the Civil War. That, as historians and scholars have noted, the Civil War and the sectional crisis was a profoundly religious moment in American history. Mark Knoll has written that from the historical record, historians have noted that there was a theological crisis over how to interpret the Bible, how to understand the Word of God and the world, and how to exercise authority of theology in a democratic society. That there was this sense in antebellum, pre-war America that we could read the Bible and try and come to a common sense understanding of what it meant. And slowly there came to be polls of how people interpreted the Bible, that some would say, obviously, we can read the Bible and see that there are justifications for slavery, as people said in the South. And people in the North were saying, of course not. There was a common sense reading that there's nothing in the Bible that would indicate that Jesus condoned slavery. And so there was this really question over how to read the Bible, how to interpret the Bible, and how to understand God at work in the world. As President Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, both the North and the South both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. That the Civil War was profoundly religious. And yet most of this story looks at this crisis of religion on a big national scale, that we have North and South differing in their opinions. We have denominations like the Methodists and Baptists that are splitting, and ultimately Presbyterians in 1895 that are splitting over this issue of slavery. That these are national, denominational, big church, capital C, questions. But what Center Church's history really shows is that this is also a local church issue, that there are local church issues at play in determining how a church is going to engage with these large social problems like slavery. At the time in the North, Christian anti-slavery and abolitionist advocates were operating in a moment that was post-millennial in nature, that people believed that they needed to perfect society, they needed to convert the world to Christianity so that Jesus could return, that they had to do all these things to make the world better in order for Jesus to return. And so societies like temperance, abolitionist societies, colonization societies, which we'll talk about, were all part of this movement to make the world better for Jesus to return. But as historian Ben Wright contends recently, that anti-slavery and abolitionist Christians began to prioritize this moral perfection, this purification, this purifying of the world for Jesus to return over and against emphasis on conversion. So there was less ideas of trying to convert people and more of trying to emphasize this purification. And he writes that both religious ideas and institutions inspired and limited the anti-slavery movement. And I would contend tonight that the history of Joel Hawes and Center Church is one of both inspiration and limitation of that anti-slavery society, and shows how this theological crisis was not just a national issue, but was a local ecclesial church issue. And so how do these two individuals, or institution and individual, come together? Joel Hawes and Center Church. So as you all know, Center Church was founded in 1632 in Massachusetts. The famed Puritan minister Thomas Hooker was your first minister who would bring the church to Connecticut about 4 years after it was founded. And it would become one of the flagship congregational churches in the city of Hartford and in the state of Connecticut. And the church made a number of prominent stances early on in its history. It was not a revivalist church. So if you've heard about the First Great Awakening, where a number of religious congregations really emphasized conversion and this kind of emotional religious revivals that inspired people to convert, Center Church was not a part of that movement and kind of resisted that in the First Great Awakening. They criticized popular preachers like George Whitefield, who kind of traversed up and down the East Coast preaching revivals. Center Church criticized him. And so Center Church was not afraid of taking stances on these issues of the day. In 1801, under the ninth pastor, Nathan Strong, the pastor that preceded Joel Hawes, Center Church was a foundational institution church in orchestrating the Plan of Union between Presbyterians and Congregationalists. The Plan of Union was a cooperation between these two denominations as they looked towards Western territories, that they would cooperate and welcome ministers of one denomination into their churches because they didn't have enough ministers to kind of plant churches out west. And so in 1818, however, Nathan Strong, after being the strong leader that had this national influence in helping orchestrate the Plan of Union, Nathan Strong passes away, and Center Church is left wondering who's going to be their next pastor. The church is in a different moment at this point in time. Nathan Strong was their pastor, like beginning in, I think it's like 1778, right before the United States was officially founded. So essentially, Center Church was in a different country, literally, in terms of looking for their pastor. They were also in a different place theologically, or the theological landscape, that a new institution for training ministers had been founded, Andover Theological Seminary, in Andover, Massachusetts. And so what did Center Church do? They reached out to some faculty members at Andover. They said, hey, we're interested in one of your students. Could you recommend them as a possible candidate for us? And the first candidate they put forward, Moses Stewart, a faculty member, reached back out and said, no, I think that would be the wrong candidate for you. I wouldn't encourage you to pursue that candidate. And so the church went back to the drawing board. They went to two other candidates that they invited to come preach for a series of Sundays, but they postponed the vote for them indefinitely. Rather than giving them the no, they said, we're going to wait and see what God tells us to do on this, which was the nice, subtle way of giving them, no, you're not going to be our next pastor. And then their fourth candidate came as a recommendation from Andover, Joel Hawes. Hawes was a unique individual at the time for a church like Center Church that was a big steeple congregation. At the time, Center Church had roughly 400 members, so it was a very, very large church at the time. Hawes did not come from a religious background. His father was a blacksmith. He didn't convert to Christianity until he was like 18 or 19. And then he went off to Brown University, at the time a Baptist school, and did his studies there, taught on the side to raise money to pay for his ability to go to school, and then from there went on to Andover. He was a really good student at Andover. People note him being incredibly studious. His biographer says he was decidedly old school, so did not really support the revivalism that had cropped back up in the 1800s, but he was, quote, circumstantially new school. So he wasn't someone who was completely opposed to revivalism. And during his time at Center Church, there would be many revivals, I think a number of 16, his biographer notes. So he wasn't opposed to revivals, but his theology was still old school in that still didn't emphasize that level of emotionalism that we saw in kind of the First Great Awakening and Second Great Awakening. And so he was called to Center Church, and as someone who was trained at Andover, he was really interested in engaging in the creation of moral societies and connecting Center Church to the wider evangelical world in the 1800s. He was well read among all the major publications of evangelicals at the time. And he was interested in becoming, the permanent pastor of Center Church for his life, which he was. At his funeral, a fellow congregational minister would describe Hawes as a bishop, which is very strange for Congregationalists practicing a democratic polity. He quoted, "We called him sometimes our Pope, Patriarch, Bishop, titles playfully applied, but significant of the fact he held the seat of honor." That he was well known throughout Congregationalist circles, but he was often in the background of a lot of movements. That if I were to say Joel Hawes in a lot of academic conferences and a lot of amongst academics of this time period, most of them would have no idea who Joel Hawes was. But he knew everyone else, and everyone else really knew him. And so he was behind the scenes orchestrating things from his time at Center Church. And so he was this unique pastor that came from kind of more humble origins to this big steeple congregation in Connecticut. And one of the first things that happened at Center Church when he got there was the founding of Colonization Society, an auxiliary of the American Colonization Society. So if Hawes was going to come in and connect Center Church to the larger evangelical world, creating societies, connecting them to other evangelical organizations, the Colonization Society at the time, 1819, was a good place to start. That this was an organization that was designed to raise money to support free Black individuals in the United States to go back to Africa and colonize what was then the colony of Liberia. And so it was in the 18 teens and 1820s, a society of individuals who were opposed to slavery in some senses, but were also trying to find solutions to the problem of slavery and race in the United States. On the one level, we can look at the Colonization Society and this auxiliary branch that was formed in Hartford, that they claimed that the Colonization Society will have a powerful tendency to produce the gradual emancipation of those now in bondage in this land of freedom. They rejected the idea that Africans were of a different or distinct species or an inferior race. They rejected that idea. But they believed that the ultimate abolition of slavery must be brought about by a moral influence only and must be done by the people of the slaveholding states themselves of their own will. And so this society tried to strike a middle ground. It got a lot of support within southern states. It got a lot of support within northern states. You can see from some of the documents here, there are a number of members, Reverend Joel Hawes there being a vice president of the Hartford Auxiliary. Seth Terry, the secretary, was also a member of Center Church, and Thomas Gallaudet, and on the right, was also a member of Center Church, and the head of the American Asylum for the Education of the Deaf at the time. And so Hartford Center Church was really involved in that, and Joel Hawes joined in and supported the work of the Colonization Society. One of the big moments in Center Church's work within the Colonization Society was the bringing in of Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori, Prince Abdul Rahman, who was a prince in Africa who was brought over and enslaved in the United States, and I believe Mississippi. And upon finding out about him, upon him being awarded his freedom and purchasing his freedom, Thomas Gallaudet came across his story and thought it was a great way for fundraising within the Colonization Society. And so Prince Abdul Rahman went on a series of visits to congregations up and down the East Coast. Thomas Gallaudet wrote a kind of pamphlet about Prince Abdul Rahman's story. And one of the sites that Prince Abdul Rahman visited, as you all know, and as Center Church has held a number of events on, was Center Church. This was largely the work and push of Thomas Gallaudet. There's not much in the archival record that I've seen that links Joel Hawes to this event, but he was pastor at the time, so he was certainly involved in the bringing of Prince Abdul Rahman to Center Church. What I find really interesting, though, about how this took place in 1828, it put Center Church in a kind of a public spotlight along with other churches about this time within the Colonization Society, and people within colonization circles took notice of this. And so one of the things that was also happening in 1828 was Joel Hawes was being courted by other churches at this time, larger pulpits. So if we think of Hartford at this time, of being one of the capital cities in Connecticut, I know there's a back and forth between Connecticut or Hartford and New Haven at the time. Hartford was not a major U.S. hub or city at the time. And so people in major cities like New York and Boston were taking note of all the work that was being done at Center Church. And you had a number of prominent colonizationist supporters in New York City that reached out to Hawes, asking him if he would come establish a church in the Bowery Presbyterian Church. And so this was done by the Tappins, who were really prominent financiers of anti-slavery and colonization ideals at the time. And so they were calling Joel Hawes to come and pastor their church. Hawes thought about it, rejected it. The Bowery Presbyterian Church came back with another minister, Samuel Cox, trying to really encourage him to come. Samuel Cox was a known abolitionist at the time, encouraging Hawes to come to New York City. But even after a second time, Hawes said, "No, I'm staying in Hartford. I'm committed to being the lifelong minister of Center Church." A few years after that, again, taking note of all the things that are happening at Center Church, Park Avenue Presbyterian Church in Boston, which is a prominent church founded that has had a long and storied history, reached out to Hawes and said, "Hey, we'd like you to be our next pastor." Hawes thought it over. A number of people recommended him for the position. And Hawes says, "No, I don't think I'm going to be able to," and passed on the offer. Similar to the Bowery Presbyterian Church, Park Avenue came back a second time, a few years later, asking again, "Would you please consider being the pastor of Park Avenue Presbyterian Church?" Again, as you can guess, knowing that Hawes stayed his entire time at Center Church, he said no. There are a few other hints of churches, I think, throughout his career that requested Hawes come and be pastor of their church. What I think this really signals is how well known he was in the larger evangelical Congregationalist Presbyterian circles at the time, and how well he was known for what was going on at Center Church, what people were doing. They were taking note of his ministry. They wouldn't be calling him if there weren't things happening at Center Church that they didn't think they could also benefit from. And so after he rejects these kind of calls, to serve as minister of another congregation, he begins to have, we begin to see in the record a type of change of heart on this issue of colonization. We don't have diary records of Hawes, so we don't have a clear moment where he writes that he had some kind of conversion experience, change of heart. We have to kind of piece that together. And to the best of my ability to do that, this change of heart came after the publication of Amos Phelps's lectures on slavery and its remedy. Amos Phelps was a minister in Massachusetts at the time who ended up leaving his congregation to devote himself full time to the work of anti-slavery. He was a colonizationist, and like many colonizations in the 1830s, he began to have problems with the organization. That they began to see that Southerners liked colonization because it meant that they would fund the removal of free blacks from Southern society back to Africa, which would remove the temptation or desire of enslaved persons to really want to fight for their freedom or try and purchase their freedom. That there was this desire that populations of free Black Americans would really kind of disrupt plantation life and life in the plantation South with so many enslaved individuals. And so Northern colonizationists who thought about colonization as being this process of gradual emancipation began to say, this is not working. This is becoming a tool of Southern society. And so Amos Phelps had this change of heart, wrote this book, Lectures on Slavery and Its Remedies, and he's calling out ministers for not addressing slavery from their pulpits. And this seems to have convicted Joel Hawes. And so there's a series of letters that he goes back and forth to Phelps on. In 1834, Joel Hawes writes, "I'm not accustomed to shrink what I know to be duty, though I cannot doubt that bringing forward the subject of abolition among my people at this time would cause a breeze." Joel Hawes has had this change of opinion, but he knows people in his congregation haven't had the same change of heart. Hawes ultimately concludes to Phelps that Phelps, I think, is really asking if he can come talk about his book at the church. And Hawes says, "I cannot see my way clear to comply with your request, that the time is not right for this." And so it's a year later, in November of 1835, that he's still in communication with Phelps. But he's getting ready. He says, "I think I am ready to address the subject of slavery and abolition with my church." Hawes has some trepidation about this. As he was in seminary, he had given a sermon at a church that didn't go over well as a seminarian. We have some records of that he stumbled into a theological difference with him and the pastor of that church in his guest sermon. And he came to the conclusion after that bungling sermon that he had that people really were angry at. He wrote, "On the whole, among strangers, it is safest and perhaps in most cases best to preach on general subjects in which serious people are all agreed." So if you don't know who you're preaching to, preach on general topics is what he's saying. But he knows Center Church. He's been there for a while and he's still hesitant to address issues of abolition. And he explains to Phelps that he thinks he's gotten the ground, that he's prepared for a, quote, calm and intelligent discussion on the subject of slavery. He worries that matters might have been going back a little bit in the last year, but where he'd been for a long time, it would be difficult to get a candid hearing on the subject of abolition at the present, but he is willing to look the opposition in the face. And so he delivers a sermon, a Thanksgiving Day sermon that is a bit unique of his style in 1835. So shortly after writing to Phelps, he gives this sermon where he addresses political issues of the day. And so he starts out with his sermon saying, he's going to use the verse from Thessalonians 5:14, "Be patient toward all men." And he admits this is not the scriptural focus of the sermon, but rather it was Hawes's plea for his congregation. his preface to his sermon, he states, quote, "It is permitted to ministers on occasion like the present to depart somewhat from the ordinary topics of Sabbath day discussion, which are not expressly revealed in the gospel of Jesus Christ." And he continues, "At the present time, I feel disposed to digress a little from my ordinary course and invite your attention to some remarks which you are not accustomed to hear from this sacred place. It is not improbable that in the course of what I have to say, I may touch on some topics which some of you may think had better be let alone. But should we differ on any of the points which may be brought into discussion, it will only furnish an occasion for both you and for me to put into practice the lesson of our text: be patient toward all men." And so he begins talking about different issues of the day. He starts off small, of the excessive worldliness of society and the disregard and forgetfulness of God. Things that you could imagine almost in any generation or era, a minister talking about. We have turned from God. We need to turn back. We're too worldly. We're too devoted to money in our careers, and we need to think more about spiritual things. But he slowly begins to build up talking about political divisions, spirit of clanship within society. He says nearly the whole society is broken up into factions and formed into combinations and clans, and all who belong to these combinations are restrained by the rules and are obliged to follow the interests of party. I'll let you draw connections, if you want, to other moments in history, past or present, of really fractious political times where people are committed to single party. So he talks about this political polarization, and he knows in his congregation he's got politicians. So Thomas Scott Williams, a prominent member, is the mayor of Hartford at the time and would become the Supreme Court justice in Connecticut. William Wolcott Ellsworth was recently stepping down from being a 3-time congressman in U.S. and would successfully run for governor 3 years later. So stepping into politics is something that his congregants already do professionally. So he moves into this kind of politics area, and then he begins to criticize Andrew Jackson's government. He says he's problem with the societal divisiveness, but also the lawlessness of a government of riots and mobs. He expresses being mortified and ashamed for his country because of the actions of the government. He doesn't mention Andrew Jackson by name, but he implicitly suggests the president and the federal government struck a blow, quote, upon the morals of this nation by its breach of faith with the Indians, for which it will soon, if ever, recover, end quote. So he's clearly referencing Andrew Jackson's unwillingness to use the federal government to enforce the Supreme Court ruling of Worcester v. Georgia, which ultimately leads to the Trail of Tears and the Indian removal in Georgia. He expresses concern over personal safety rights and a government of law that is prostrated and the government of riotousness substituted in his place. That he sees this as a government without laws, that's not abiding by the courts, that is acting upon its own will. And he's saying this is a problem in our society that we need to fix. He further then builds upon this criticism of Andrew Jackson, and he turns towards the delicate issue of fanaticism at the time, Christian disunion. And he talks about the wrongs and woes of 2 million of my enslaved countrymen who cry for sympathy and release. He talks about the unwillingness of people to engage in this topic of conversation, the gag orders that Southerners placed on people to have conversations over slavery. And he says, look, I get it. I have frustrations with some abolitionists too. He talks about some 2 or 3 solitary abolitionists who use harsh and irritating language and have adopted some indiscreet and hurtful measures in their quest for perfectionism. But he says we have to think of or pray for 2.5 million of unhappy beings redeemed by the blood of Christ who yet live in bondage in this boasted land of liberty. He was diplomatic, but he was clear that enslaved persons in the United States are redeemed by Christ, that they are full human beings and that they should not be enslaved. He concludes this sermon saying, if anything I have said in this discourse ruffles the feelings of anyone here, He will, of course, see the propriety of bringing home to himself the lesson of the text to be patient towards all men. He also acknowledged, should any remarks come to my knowledge respecting what I have said, indicating that it was thought ill-timed or uncalled for, out of place, or in any way adapted to disturb my feelings, he would also strive to himself be patient toward all men. And so he's trying to be very diplomatic here, knowing that he has a congregation that's not where he is, but trying to stake out his place and push the congregation forward a little bit. Abolitionists were very proud of Hawes in some ways, very still not feeling he went far enough in other ways. Abolitionists would call this Hawes's coming out. Abolitionists would refer to the coming out of a lot of ministers, that they would get them to come out on the issue of abolition. Amos Phelps wrote to William Lloyd Garrison, the famed kind of really classical abolitionist we can think of in American history among white abolitionists, that Hawes had come out totally on the subject, but had taken some exceptions and some justification for his long and guilty silence. Phelps praised Hawes for doing this, but was also frustrated that Hawes didn't go far enough. He claimed that he told Garrison, Phelps did, that they should show Hawes and similar-minded ministers no mercy, and that they should treat them with the due respect and acknowledge the good that they say and thank them for it, and at the same time make the public see how their contradictions they eat and re-eat their own words. That there is this idea that Hawes, having frustrations with abolitionists, should not be his primary concern, that he should be a full-throated abolitionist and should not be offering these qualifications. And so we have this where we have Hawes coming out, and we don't get a lot in the historical record from church members as to what repercussions there were from this. It wasn't until 2 years later that he delivers what Theodore Weld, another prominent abolitionist of the era, called an anti-slavery sermon, high and dry. And that in this sermon in 1837, he begins to think, he has a structure of preaching to his congregations that you need to have your heart in the work that you want to do. That he starts with the prophets and says, if you look in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, we see these prophets like, look at Ezekiel, Jeremiah, they had to have their heart in their work. There was no, there was no half-assing cooking your food over fecal matter, if in Ezekiel's case. You had to have your heart in your work. And he goes through all these examples of Christians who have had their heart in their work. And then he comes to abolitionists and says, British abolitionists are kindred spirits engaged in this noble enterprise of abolition, and they exemplify this quality of having your heart in your work, really being committed to what you're doing. Again, in this, he's calling slavery a monstrous system of inequality. He says enslaved persons are immortal beings formed in the image of God and redeemed by the blood of Christ. And he says abolitionism is a noble example of what may be accomplished in a righteous cause when individuals have their heart in their work. And so this sermon, unlike the sermon in the Thanksgiving service from 2 years earlier, really strikes a nerve among congregants. The reaction is swift, according to Theodore Weld, that there was a great wrath that came down upon him from people in the congregation, and that there were individuals that were threatening to dismiss him from the church. Hawes had been at the church now, almost 20 years at this point, and this one sermon, people are saying, we think we should dismiss him over this. Weld says if Center Church had known, they may have shut him out of the pulpit and would not have allowed him to preach this sermon. And Weld kind of further pushes the boundaries to say one of the reasons why is he says Center Church is filled with colonization Connecticut, people that are colonizationists of Connecticut par excellence, that they are colonizationists through and through, and they were not having this abolitionist sermon. Weld, I think, is a helpful source here. He was not a member of Center Church, but his brother Lewis Weld was. And so his brother Lewis Weld worked with Gallaudet with the Asylum for the Deaf, and was a member of Center Church. And so Theodore Weld had a beat on this congregation. It was his brother's church. He certainly knew about it. He knew Hawes, had talked with Hawes about this sermon. I think it is fair to say, I think this was the reaction of the congregation. Hawes, in turn, has a choice. He knows this church, Center Church, is not where it needs to be in terms of abolitionists from his perspective. But he's been there and he's been committed to this congregation and to this community. And so from my perspective from the record, Hawes begins to participate more in abolitionist activities as an individual. That he tries to kind of differentiate his ministerial life from his kind of private activities. Certainly, he's still recognized as the pastor of this, but he's trying to navigate this world in which he wants to be a committed abolitionist, but he has a congregation that is unwilling to follow him in this change of heart, moving from colonization to abolition. And so he writes this piece that showed up in a newspaper, The Colored American, that I believe was really it showed up, I think, in a couple places, but I believe the readership of The Colored American was largely of Black Americans at the time. And he writes that he has some disagreements with abolitionists, but that he's not going to let the merits of the cause. He's going to separate the merits of the cause from the imperfections of its advocacy here. That he's going to say, I'm going to support this, even though I disagree with the way some abolitionists go about doing this work. He acknowledges that he's got a station of great responsibility, and he acts as if the duties are of paramount importance might excuse him, and he has acted in the past as if the duties of paramount importance might excuse him from taking any active part in abolition. So he's relied on the fact, I've been in this big steeple church. I can't come out and say this because I'm in this big steeple church, and that's an important job for me to have. And he confesses in this that I now feel to have been wrong, though I did not intend it. And I hasten to make what atonement I can by wishing you to insert my name as a member of your society, the anti-slavery society here. I may not have it in my power to serve this cause to the extent of my wishes, but I wish to have known on which side I am. There is no room for doubt. So he has this letter that comes out a few months after this. This is an 1837 letter that's published in these papers where he is saying, look, this is where I am, but I may not be able to support this cause as much given where I am in society, and I may not have the ability to do everything I want to because of this church that I'm a part of. So he's striking this balance in these abolitionist activities and his persona as a minister at Center Church. But he begins to start to have some disagreements with the abolitionists. And he's staked his claim with abolitionists, but then he feels like he's not really quite meeting them where they are with everything either. Abolitionists have a big break over questions of women's rights, of whether or not the abolitionist movement should be fighting for women's rights. You have a number of ministers that ultimately will break away and form their own American and foreign anti-slavery society that will be more Christian, perhaps we might say, in focus of ministers, and more focused on churches, that doesn't support women's rights but does support abolition. We see that Hawes is decidedly, from some abolitionists like Ann Weston and Mary Weston, scared to death about the women's question. Henry Clark Wright, another abolitionist, accuses Hawes of fearing to lose his place in his lust for power and clerical pride. The Hartford Courant reported that Hawes really preferred to stand aloof from these political excitements and tried to stay out of some of this. But I think there's a lot to suggest that he had trouble going everywhere the abolitionists did. And I think that the women's issue was one of these issues that really pushed him. His most famous work that people know him for is his lectures on young men that he published in the 1820s and had multiple reprintings, where he writes a lot about how young men should be in the world. And so he has a lot of ideas about masculinity and what it means to be a good Christian man. And so I think some of that influences some of his disagreement with abolitionists here. But even if he does disagree with these abolitionists, he does open the portico of Center Church for Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and prominent abolitionists that also support women's rights to come and speak from the steps of Center Church. There are a number of ways, I think, to read this. That in Hartford, Frederick Douglass writes that a lot of doors were shut to them, that they weren't open anywhere really to speak. And so Center Church allowed them to speak there, which says something. But the fact that they weren't speaking inside the church also says something. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like this event really encapsulates Hawes's brokering of two sides of his confessional life, of being committed to Center Church and being committed to pastoring this community of faith, but also being committed to abolition. That bringing Frederick Douglass and those to the steps of Center Church was, from my reading of this, something of a compromise. That we don't have any indication that there was conflict in church records from this. We have to kind of read between the lines here. But based on who Hawes was, this seems to be the case. And so Hawes and Center Church go on like this for a while throughout the kind of 40s. 1843 was when Frederick Douglass came. And throughout the 40s, there is this, a few records that kind of show this back and forth, where Hawes is doing some work with abolitionism, but is still kind of brokering this middle ground. It's not until we get to the conflict in the Tract Society that this conflict really becomes a problem again in Center Church. And so the Tract Society is a prominent national organization that's established in 1825 that publishes tracts, Christian tracts, to flood the U.S. landscape with, Christian, tracts on all sorts of issues. And as it's founded, it's publishing across evangelical traditions, so publishing material that all evangelicals could agree upon. And by the time we get into the sectional crisis, by the 40s and 50s, there's a lot of pushing of we need to have tracts on slavery and the problems of slavery. But there's these questions that Southerners support the Tract Society. So how are we going to navigate this issue that evangelicals are disagreed on? Can we publish things related to slavery? Can we not? And as any good religious organization with all sorts of committees, they form a special committee to investigate whether or not how their publishing practices should address this issue. And Center Church is in the middle of this. That at the time, Center Church member Thomas Williams, who is Supreme Court Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, is president of the American Tract Society. And he approves the appointment of this special committee, which includes Joel Hawes as a member of this committee. And so this committee goes about doing its work. They take about a year to come to their decisions as to, what they should recommend the Tract Society do according to this issue. And Hawes and the special committee come to this agreement that the Tract Society should, not be publish things that commit it to being a special organ of any one system of religious or moral reform, such as temperance, peace, anti-popery, anti-slavery, etc. That they're not going to be a single issue publishing thing. So they're not going to only focus on one single issue. That if they're publishing in a way where they're addressing all sorts of issues, that's okay. They can publish anti-slavery stuff, but they can't become the sole publishing arm for the Anti-Slavery Society. The second principle they make is that the Tract Society should not publish on the, quote, political aspects of slavery, but should rather focus on those moral duties which grow out of the existence of slavery, as well as those moral evils and vices which it is known to promote. So they're trying to steer clear of influencing American politics on this, but addressing the moral and theological issues at the same time. We can question whether or not you can do that. That was what this special committee was trying to drive this middle ground for in this. And so special committee brings this forward. And then as a special committee, they don't have any control over how this is implemented. And so the special committee presents their report, and now the Tract Society has to go about, well, how do we implement this recommendation of not being a single issue and not publishing on the political aspects? And over the next year, the publishing committee then says, all right, how we're going to interpret this is in this way. After the publishing committee says they report back after a year that they gave their best efforts to the work of obtaining a tract discussing the evils and duties so indicated of slavery, that it was a moral issue. It's not going to be a single issue. And that they're following the interpretation of the special committee's report and they have to determine that a publication must, one, not be connected with any organization too closely of a single issue. Two, must not discuss the political aspects of slavery. And three, must be calculated to receive the general consensus of evangelical Christians. They conclude that an individual doesn't exist who can write something that satisfies all of those. And so essentially they say, we have heard the special committee that says we can publish on anti-slavery stuff. We're still not going to do it because we don't think anyone can actually thread that needle. This creates a big problem among supporters of the Tract Society. And so there is a reaction, and the Tract Society splits. You have a Tract Society in New York, where the national headquarters are, that stay the course, that are like, nope, we're not going to publish anything on anti-slavery because we can't thread that needle well enough. Then we also have a one that emerges in Boston, that is an anti-slavery society in terms of Boston in this. Joel Hawes ends up supporting the Boston Tract Society. His congregants, including Thomas Williams and Governor Ellsworth and other big name members of the congregation, publish a tract supporting the New York branch. And they use one another's words against them in public discourse and public tracts that they write. Governor Ellsworth saying that he doesn't think that the Tract Society should publish these anti-slavery tracts says, I'm a practical man myself. I don't like techniques anywhere. I don't like them in my profession nor in theology. I wish to deal with the subject as much as my beloved pastor deals with the great truths of this death from Sabbath to Sabbath. He has taught me the importance of common sense, of the inculcation of truth. What in the end is to be gained? This is the question. Or in another form, how can the society and its publication, all of which are good and correct as far as I go, reach the greatest number of mind and plant in them the seeds of Christian truth? That if we start publishing these slavery tracts, we're going to lose people, that we can't do that. I'm listening to my pastor and my pastor's words when I make this decision. Joel Hawes, however, is advocating something else. He's advocating, no, we need to be making a stand on slavery. We need to be publishing on this. And he uses his congregants' words against them. He says, quoting Thomas Williams from 1820, we deprecate the diffusion of the slaveholding spirit, so hostile to the temper of religion, which is at once the brightest ornament and surest strength of a people, and so ungrateful in its exercise towards that being to whose justice we appealed when we ourselves felt the pressure of that very yoke of bondage, which now bears with more galling and cruel weight on thousands of our fellow men. That Hawes says, yeah, if you're going to use your words against me, I'm going to use your words against you. That you said this in 1820, and what's changed? You thought slavery was bad then. Why are you unwilling to take a stand on it now? And so we have this public back and forth. And the only thing that I can see that resolves this, of how the church negotiated this difference, was following the money, looking at the budget. And there seems to be some sort of compromise at Center Church as Hawes is pastoring this church, getting towards the end of his pastorate, the end of his life, that we see in some of these later annual church reports that the church is giving a lot of money in today's money, that they're giving donations of $10,334, which today is over $400,000 a year to different ministries across the U.S. And they've divided it. So they're giving some of that money to the Tract Society of Boston, some of it to the Tract Society of New York, and some to the Colonization Society. So in 1860, Hawes is pastoring this church that has some people that are saying, yes, evangelicals need to publish on slavery. Some that are saying, no, we shouldn't be taking a stand on this issue. Others that are saying we need to be working on helping formerly enslaved individuals get back to Africa to colonize Liberia. These donations go down a lot in 1861, and they note that many of these are from a few individuals, but it shows that you have a lot of few individuals with big political opinions on this issue that are all in disagreement with one another. And so this is what I think creates this ecclesial crisis, that you have this question of how does a church have a pastor who believes one thing, but members of a church who believe something else. That this is where I see this ecclesial crisis, this church crisis coming in. That what does it mean for a church to have a pastor that's trying to lead you towards a particular idea, but a church that isn't willing to follow? I think these questions raise all sorts of questions for leadership of pastors today, how we think about purity tests in the political positions that we have. Hawes was clearly someone that says, I'm not going to allow the imperfections of an organization affect me from supporting the merits of a cause. That he has that differentiation in himself, and he's having to negotiate all of these different parties in his church. And so I know I've gone to 8 o'clock, and I'd love to have time for questions. So I think I'll end it there and open it up for questions you have, perhaps thinking about kind of implications of this, applications of this, thinking about this in the present era.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Thank you so much. So what I've noticed is I've invited some people to go into the chat. You're getting some applause online, some of those symbols online of applause. But I had invited people to leave questions in the chat, and some people have done that. So maybe we can address some of those first and then go to any that the body has live, living, and in color. The first question here is from Her Royal Highness Princess Karen Chapman, descendant of Prince Abdul Rahman. Good evening. Thank you so much.
How are you doing?
Go ahead with your question.
Yes, I think Andrew actually answered quite a bit of it, because I wanted to know what was the church's position with enslaved people. And I think he did a very good job on answering that. I think I asked my person a little bit but I found that I think that was a torn, and that's kind of what I wanted to kind of touch on, is to see, it seems as though Reverend Hawes had sort of a change of heart. He was beginning to feel as though slavery was unjust, it wasn't godly, but he had a congregation that still wanted the colonization and kind of wanted to not rock the boat. Is that what I was understanding?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the phrase "not wanting to rock the boat" seems to be very apt for a lot of, at least what I read of, Thomas Gallaudet and some of the colonizationists, that this was a society that spanned North and South. And so Gallaudet at one point in the 1830s was trying to fund a newspaper that would present both sides of this issue, but would have a greater number of editorial representation from the South. And so he was more willing to entertain some of that for the perhaps cooperation. I think there's Hawes is something that's willing to take more of a stand. What I think is really interesting, we don't know from what I can't figure out from, we don't have like a diary or of anything, is if Hawes had a church that backed him where would he have been on the issue? So that he is in a position where he is having to negotiate a lot of different things. So it's hard to know and pin down Hawes. I see, Carter, your question of what is his theology for this? We don't have a lot of like theological writings from him about these types of issues to know specifically where he stood. So it would be a very interesting question to think about, how much did Center Church hold him back in his real opinions? How much were they kind of negotiating this middle ground?
It was interesting, and then I'll cut this short, but it was interesting because when I was reviewing some of the archives and some of the historical documents for my great-grandfather, Prince Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Asori, my grandmother, Isabella, that was emancipated with him, was still speaking with Thomas Gallaudet after her husband died, because he died 4 months after his emancipation. And she actually spoke with him, who was a member of Center Church at the time, to get 2 of her sons released, which was Levi and Simon. So I've had a feeling that without his blessing, Thomas Gallaudet would not have had the empowerment to have Douglas or either my grandfather come to the church. And so for that reason, I've always kind of felt that perhaps he just didn't speak a lot, because during those times you couldn't speak about it. And, he wanted to stay in Connecticut. He loved his church, apparently. And I think this is the stance that he tried to take and tried to help sort of in the background. That was just my personal opinion of it. Thank you so much. You did a brilliant job on covering the material for me.
Gotcha.
Thank you so much, Princess Karen. We also have Chris. Chris, you had a question?
Well, an awful lot of the complexity of Northern response to slavery is, as is often the case with morality, tied up with money. And so my question was, and I'm not sure you really had time to get into how many of the members of Center Church were industrialists that had economic ties to the slave trade, or not slave trade at that point, but the slave economy.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I can answer it in 2 ways. First, I would say, one of the things Edna Edith Sayers writes, particularly about Thomas Gallaudet in his work with the asylum in Hartford at the time, is that that organization did very clearly profit from slavery and was mortgaging land in the South and was drawing on money from the slave economy for that. So it is very present. The other thing that I will say in terms of kind of how I ended up focusing on kind of this research over the summer was more from an institutional perspective. So I didn't track down any individual members to see where their money was coming from. But I think you're absolutely right. In Connecticut, particularly in all parts of New England, the North was profiting from the slave economy. The North was bringing goods up. I generally tend to take some of that as a given, that there are very few, these economies are so closely intertwined. No one is really, it would be hard pressed for me to find someone in New England or in the North that was making a lot of money that wasn't tied up in some way towards this broader slave economy. And so I don't have any individuals that I can give you for that. But thank you,
Chris. Thank you very much. We got some really good church members here, so I'm glad to see church members from Center Church here. Go ahead, Bill. You are.
First, thanks, Dr. Gardner, for the very good, and helpful kind of overview of a very dense and difficult time. The question I have is how you would distinguish, or how you see the role of a prominent pastoral minister in a community at that time, and how that is different, say, from somebody like Thomas Gallaudet or somebody like Theodore Dwight Weld, who was, kind of involved in the split at Lane Seminary, and was a real kind of free spirit, Garrison. I mean, they're wonderful abolitionists who were really prodding people. And then there were pastors in, as you say, the big steeple churches, who are trying to hold things together. How do you distinguish between those two kind of roles in the antebellum, North and South?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And like one way I think I would say is this is not necessarily a historical question in a lot of ways, that I think this is a question for much of U.S. history when we think about big steeple churches and like cultural institutions and leadership of those cultural institutions and social change. And so, in other work that I've done, I think Eric mentioned, I've written a history of a congregation in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. That was a very progressive congregation that you have pastors of that church that can do some things really well, but they can't do other things in ways that ministers that are within the congregation that don't have that tie to leadership of a community can act in different ways. So, the way I would distinguish that is thinking about questions of power. That Hawes clearly understood he had a very particular type of power as being the pastor of Center Church in Hartford, Connecticut. That coming from a big steeple church like that gave him a platform and a voice that was distinct from Gallaudet, Weld, and other people.
Thank you, Church Librarian Bill Warner Prouty.
Yeah. And so, thinking about this in terms of power, I think Hawes, that's how I think about it, that Hawes is making a calculated decision of here is how I'm going to use power. And like, that's something that we as 21st century observers, we have hindsight to be able to think, well, maybe I don't think he used that power effectively enough. Maybe he didn't push his congregation enough. Maybe there were one or two people that were keeping him from doing this, and maybe they didn't need to be part of the community. Maybe he should have said, I'm sure, having been in a lot of different churches over my life, we all know that there are members who are very stubborn, and pastors have to deal with that. And so as we look back on this, I think we have to think about the power that he had, whether he used it effectively, how he used it effectively. Those are the questions, I think, as I would think about. Yeah.
We have Craig. Craig is a member, Reverend Craig is a member of Center Church. He had a question as well. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, actually, a real quick comment, too. As a retired career pastor, I can certainly understand with his struggle of deciding what you're going to preach on and who's going to get upset. I've had to face that decision many, many times, and I've gotten buttonholed by parishioners who were very upset about what I said. So that's today. Especially with the political environment we're in right now, that is a very real thing that many, many clergy have to deal with. But my question was about the issue of white supremacy. I'm just wondering, I guess I already know the answer to this, but I was curious if he talks at all about his view of people of African descent. As you know, it was a very commonly held view during the 19th century that people of African descent were inferior to whites. And I'm wondering if he ever said anything along that line to indicate how he might have felt about it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think this is a very difficult one to try and think about in terms of the language that we have today, going back, looking at the historical moment. So I think I mentioned in the Colonization Society, like they have a quote that they do not believe that Africans are a different species or are inferior in any way. So they have these statements like that. Yet at the same time, none of their actions really would try and indicate that even if we think about William Lloyd Garrison as being kind of the pinnacle of an abolitionist, a white abolitionist in the United States, he and Garrison had a falling out over how to approach, the Constitution in some ways that I think was kind of fueled by Garrison's unwillingness to listen to Frederick Douglass. on Frederick Douglass says, I can see myself in the Constitution. We don't need to rewrite the Constitution. And Garrison says, no, there's no, Garrison saying, no, I don't agree with you, and not listening in some ways. And this is why Douglass goes off and has his own North Star newspaper.
Thank you, Greg. So we have another question in the chat room, and I don't know how much time you have after that. You'll let me know. But Kyle Roberts, you had a question.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew. Fantastic talk. I guess there's kind of two thoughts going through my mind as I'm hearing and thinking about Hawes and his relationship to his congregation. One is up here at the Congregational Library, we are focused on the American Revolution, and we are looking a great deal at ministers who are, at odds with their congregation. But what I guess is kind of striking is it doesn't sound like, despite their differences, the congregation really turned their back or walked out on Hawes. So, what we see in New York, what we see during the American Revolution is ministers who are perceived to be loyalists have their windows shot out, have their firewood taken away, are, fired, pretty drastic actions. I guess the other thought in my head is the kind of New York City scene, which is granted a bigger religious marketplace, where people vote with their feet, right? They're just, Harvard had plenty of congregational churches that folks could go to. So I wonder if you're seeing something interesting there about the relationship between minister and congregation. And maybe it's something, special about Center Church. Maybe it's something about the kind of congregational ideals of being a covenanted community. But, is that the case that in fact people are kind of putting up with it and trying to figure out how to work it out rather than just taking off?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one, I don't know if I have a clear answer as to, how this, certainly, we think, I mentioned Samuel Cox as a church in New York who's run out of his church. And there are certainly examples where this doesn't work for ministers. And the Revolution, I think, is a great example. Those are great examples of things not working out. The one thing that I think stands out to me is the church knew Hawes was being poached. And so the church had a knowledge that Hawes could be elsewhere. And, this is not this is a question of space and place and how space and place is valued in the world. New York and Boston are much bigger cities where Hawes would have a much greater emphasis. That if Hawes had gone to Bowery Presbyterian or Park Street Avenue, scholars today would know his name. I would believe that scholars would know his name today. That Hawes staying at Center Church was staying in a smaller market religious community. And I think, I have to think that carried some weight, at least in forging those relationships in the early 1830s for when 1835 and 37 happened, and ultimately when the big disagreement in the 50s happened. In the 50s, he was also in the twilight of his career. It may have been one thing where they're like, we've stuck with this guy for 40 years. We're not gonna we have a disagreement on who we're gonna fund. We'll let the people who want to fund the Boston Tract Society fund that. We'll let the people fund the New York Society fund that. And so it is remarkable, though, that he was able to stay in community, and people. To my knowledge, it doesn't look like people left as a result of this. So that's a great question, one that still remains a little mysterious to me.
I have a couple of comments on that. One, I'm thinking back to a really good program that we had with the late Bill Hawsley, who looked at our collection of Hawes library and various things in the church library. And he commented that Hartford really was, at that time, very much a center for book publication. And Hawes is an inveterate, I mean, must have been a reader and also a serious student and reader of sermons. I mean, I would say that, aside from journals, missionary journals, there is a large representation in his library of sermons, and he took preaching seriously. And he was in the middle of Hartford at a time in Connecticut and New England of very sort of rich, kind of theological exploration and discussion. He had close connections with Yale University and the development there. I mean, he, in a sense, for a small small town guy from Milford, Massachusetts, or Medford, I guess, coming down to Hartford, and he had a large family, and why give all of that up? In a sense, I think that he really did, for a farm boy from the Boston area, who took education very seriously. He landed in a very good place and realized it.
Well, I want to say we are at time, and this has been a fascinating lecture, a fascinating journey that we've been on the past few years, but really this summer, working with Dr. Gardner to say thank you to him. Stephen Lewis and I basically were his research assistants, going through the archives and finding fascinating information. We're still going to talk about how to roll out to the congregation and others who are interested in learning more about this church's history during the antebellum era. I would like to take a few minutes to acknowledge a few people. We thank all of you for coming, but we want to acknowledge a few people. We'll begin first with Her Royal Highness Sheikha Karen Chapman, who is the guardian of Prince Sori's legacy. Thank you for being here. Dr. Kyle Roberts from the Congregational Library and Archives in Boston. We are planning to visit during AAR to look at some of our records there and to catch up with Andrew and spend some time with him. And then I would be remiss if I did not mention Kiana Calafiore from the Connecticut Museum for History and Culture, who found those sermons and so many more documents that have been pivotal to this process. So I want to acknowledge her publicly and thank her. As a matter of fact, I'll even give you a chance to say a few words, Kiana. Would you like to say a few words?
Dr. Hurst, this was definitely a journey that we went through. In our collections, we have many of Hawes' sermons. We also went through lots of research looking into Prince Abdul Rahman and finding account books and pamphlets. It was honestly a truly amazing treasure to look through the archives and find stuff to fill in the blanks for this story and to keep adding on to it. And I'm learning so much thanks to this lecture. And I really hope in the future we could learn more, continue to put pieces together, and honestly just get this story out there. It would be really amazing to let most of Connecticut know how this great history that Hartford has. So thank you.
Thank you, Kiana. Sandra Susi from the Norwich Historical Society, thank you for being here. Rudy Giuliani from the Norwich Free Academy Slater Museum, thank you so much. And all of you, again, thank you for joining us and investing in this work. I think there's more to come out of this in the future as we continue to just go through the archives and find stuff on the shelves that will be of interest to all of those who are concerned about historical preservation, historical memory in Hartford and the broader country. We thank you again, Bishop John Selders. We want to acknowledge you this evening, Bishop. Thank you for being with us, Amistad UCC and Trinity College. We thank you all for being with us this evening. We will let you know when we have more programs that are going to be available to the public. March 4th, Dr. Jennifer Barkley from SUNY Binghamton is going to present on her book, Disability, Race, and Gender in Antebellum America. And that is a topic that runs right through Center Church. And we've got some other things in the works. So again, tonight we say thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Dr. Gardner, please stay on. Andre Kitt, please stay on. Tammy Denise, we want to make sure we recognize you, Connecticut Freedom Trail Outreach Coordinator. Thank you so very much for being with us. And hopefully, folks, we'll see you again soon, okay? Have a good evening.